Alrighty, guys. Thanks for tuning in to Fancy Free Philosophy, the world-renowned and highly profound pinnacle of broadcast professionalism. To serve everyone regardless of your political beliefs, I'm just going to provide the pure info, events, and facts. It's not my job to tell you what to think about Iran and Qasem Soleimani. I'll just give you all the relevant info I've gathered. Then you can decide if killing Soleimani was a good move. I studied 40 years of Iran's military actions, so you can learn it all several hours faster than I did, so it'll save you some time. I did the work for you here. I love studying this stuff. So this channel is just to share the fruits of my studies with you. I read a lot, so I might as well make something out of it here. And unlike the partisan hacks pretending to be journalists, I'll give you my opinion and analysis of the events last. But it doesn't really matter what I think. Grown adults can think for themselves, especially when they're actually given the facts. Now, obviously, if you haven't already noticed, almost every political commentator and journalist claims to have the facts or the truth or whatever, so you can't really take anyone's word for it. So hopefully my work here speaks for itself. My videos can be kind of long, but that's because I get pretty meticulous about collecting all the facts that I can for you folks. So we'll just get into the material. First, let's remember Trump campaigned against the Bush-style military interventionism of the past couple decades, especially on expensive, indefinite engagements in the Middle East. And in fact, Trump's the first president since at least the 1980s, possibly the 70s, who hasn't started a new war. Now, he's done a few strikes, and we're still in most previous foreign engagements. Other than that, he's actually reduced our military engagements. So let's go through the recent timeline with Iran. In mid-June 2019, Iran attacked 2 oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman near the strategic Strait of Hormuz. And then days later, also in June 2019, Iran shot down a $16 million U.S. Navy drone, an unprovoked attack in international airspace. Now, the U.S. military fully prepared a retaliatory strike. They pressured Trump to authorize. Ultimately, Trump actually aborted the operation. Now, there was an interview on NBC with Chuck Todd, and Todd says, "Let me start right in. What happened last night?" Now, this is why he's asking why Trump stopped the planned military strike on Iran. And here's Trump, quote, "We are sitting with 150 dead people. That would have taken place probably within a half an hour after I said, go ahead, and I didn't like it. I didn't think it was proportionate." So what happened here, Trump asked the commanders in charge how many people would die. They told him about 150 as an estimate. He thought about it for a while. And then he called it off because killing 150 Iranian people for an inanimate object, however expensive it was, $16 million, just didn't feel right or just to him. Now, sometime I'm going to make a video about the things I don't like about Trump. There's plenty of legitimate ways to criticize him, but some of the anti-Trump people in the media regarding this Iran stuff won't mention that to you, because it actually shows that Trump is not just a full-fledged warmonger without a heart. So, now, these next 2 Iranian attacks involve oil, which most people understand the general idea, but I'll explain a more specific motive after I explain these events. So, in July 2019, Iran seized a British oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz, commonly called theft or stealing. They stole the British oil tanker. Now, this Strait of Hormuz is where 35% of the world's seaborne oil travels through, meaning that in total, roughly 20% of the world's oil supply travels through the Strait of Hormuz. That strait is located in the Persian Gulf. Also, Iran briefly detained another British oil tanker, so in the end, they didn't steal the second one. And then September 2019, Iran executed a missile and drone attack on 2 Saudi Arabian oil facilities. It's run by a company called Aramco. Now, Soleimani actually orchestrated that attack, according to the most recent info I found from 3 different sources across the political spectrum. This attack on the Aramco oil facilities knocked out 5.7 million barrels of daily oil production, or actually more than 5% of the world's daily crude oil production. Now, what makes that significant is Saudi Arabia has been a U.S. ally since 1945, when President Franklin Roosevelt arranged with King Abdul Aziz that we would provide them security and military defense in exchange for oil. And Saudi Arabia is the U.S. defense industry's largest foreign customer. They bought $112 billion in weapons during the Obama administration. So Trump's been criticized for being too friendly with Saudi Arabia, but to put it in context, like I said, this has been an alliance that's lasted 75 years. Now, the journalist Khashoggi getting killed, that's a topic for another time, but this 75-year alliance, it's good to keep that in mind. Now, basically, Iran and Soleimani's attack on Aramco knocked out about half of Saudi Arabia's oil production for a few days. Since I'm finished detailing Iran's oil-related attacks, like I mentioned earlier, we can explain some motives now. Might be obvious to many of you, but I don't want anyone to miss out on this insight. So basically, these were attacks related to world oil supply, oil trading routes, etc. Now, Iran briefly wiped out a decent chunk of the world's oil supply chain with the attack on Aramco. So the key to this, if Iran could achieve those kinds of results on a more consistent basis and or get control of the Strait of Hormuz, they could intentionally reduce the world's oil supply pretty significantly, which would cause oil prices to shoot up, meaning they could make a lot more money on their oil exports. So that's the key there. And since Iran is the world's number one funder of terrorism, it's not too hard to guess where a lot of those oil profits will be spent. Over the past couple years, you've seen a lot of Iranian citizens in pretty large protests against the regime, months before this whole Soleimani thing. Basically, they're kind of tired, or a lot of them are tired of Iran blowing a lot of money in their terrorism, outside of the domestic borders, and their quality of life is suffering. So a lot of them are fed up, and they want them to stop blowing money outside of the country and to maybe focus more on their own citizens. Now, it's very important to note that Qasem Soleimani was classified as a terrorist in 2007 by George W. Bush, but what really makes that more significant is that Obama also classified Qasem Soleimani as a terrorist in 2015. So 3 consecutive presidents of both parties. Now, Soleimani was responsible for orchestrating attacks on coalition bases in Iraq over the past several months. The most significant one of these attacks was on December 27th, 2019. Over 30 rockets were fired at an Iraqi security forces base in Kirkuk. That is Kirkuk. This base houses American and Iraqi coalition forces who are fighting the anti-ISIS campaign together. So this December 27th attack killed 1 American contractor and wounded several Iraqi troops and American personnel. This was at least the 11th rocket attack against U.S. bases and interests in Iraq over the previous 2 months. So the 11th rocket attack in Iraq alone. Iran funds and commands militia proxy forces as a smokescreen to obscure their terrorist and combat activities. So the Kirkuk rocket attack was executed by a branch of Hezbollah known as Kataib Hezbollah. That's Kata''ib space then Hizbollah. Now Hezbollah is usually spelled with an E, but that's Hiz instead of Hez for that. Now, Qasem Soleimani also approved the attacks on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad that began on New Year's Eve. Basically, he and 1 other commander were in charge of the operation and the planning. And ultimately, Qasem Soleimani was the one who mobilized, organized, and commanded Practically all of Iran's proxy militias in various countries, such as Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Afghanistan, and I think there's a couple others. Soleimani's recruited thousands of minors into these militias as well. In Iran's proxy militia in Afghanistan, over 5,000 child militia fighters under the age of 18 have died under Soleimani's leadership. Now, Iran's proxy militias, commanded by Soleimani, also include the terrorist group known as Hamas. One important piece of land Hamas controls is the Gaza Strip bordering Israel. You've probably heard about that. I'll just briefly touch on it. So, to my knowledge, for at least several years now, Hamas has fired a cumulative total of thousands of rockets into Israel. Just in any one day, there's been days where they fired hundreds in just one day. Now, they fire these with utter disregard to strategic precision, resulting in mostly civilian casualties. But that's actually one of the goals. Now, Iran and Soleimani obviously provide the rockets for these attacks. Now, Israel painstakingly avoids civilian casualties, which is why Hamas and other anti-Israel and anti-Jewish terrorist groups, they place and mount rocket launchers on top of numerous mosques and other civilian buildings. And they actually have military and terrorist headquarters operating in the basement of mosques, just because they know Israel won't risk killing civilians. Now, on the Friday after Soleimani's death, Yemen's pro-Tehran rebels, who control the capital Sana'a, that is S-A-N-A-A, I might be mispronouncing that, but they called for swift reprisals for the killing of senior Iranian commander Major General Qasem Soleimani in that U.S. strike in Baghdad where, Trump ordered the killing of Soleimani. So here's a quote: "We condemn this killing, and direct and swift reprisals are the answer." Senior rebel political official Mohammed Ali al-Houthi tweeted. Now, the most important part of that story, if you noticed, this Iranian proxy militia literally controls the capital of Yemen. They control Yemen's capital. Like, that's astonishing. Just imagine if Canada controlled Washington, D.C. with some proxy militia. That's the most key part of that story. That's amazing. That just kind of showcases the blatant imperialism. It's pretty incredible. Now, a critical part of being able to grasp the overarching story of Iran after the 1979 revolution is understanding the Ayatollah Khomeini's vision. Now, his vision was not an Iranian revolution. He was against nationalism. He valued Islam above Iran. It was supposed to be an Islamic revolution. He saw himself as a sort of pope figure, as sort of a religious leader to all Muslims. It was called exporting the revolution far beyond Iran's borders. So Soleimani was actually the person who forged that vision into a tangible reality. Soleimani is often referred to as Khomeini's sword. An essential factor in the formation of these proxy militias in these foreign countries is that the militias have an ideological and religious allegiance to the Ayatollah and the mullahs in Iran. Now, the original Ayatollah passed away like 20 years ago, I think, but there's another one right now. So more specifically, all these militias and people in foreign countries that actually aren't in the militias, they're all unified under Shiite or Shia Islam. Now, there's two pronunciations, Shiite and Shia. It's the same thing. I don't know how to properly use it, because I think they can both be used as nouns, but one of them can be used as adjectives, so I'll just use Shia going forward. Now, Soleimani was the essential figure in orchestrating the unification of Shia Muslims under this common allegiance. So, the best analogy I could think of to help illustrate this is comparing it to the similar phenomenon of the Knights Templar. So, the Templar Knights were Christian monks and were the most feared fighting force during the Crusades. They were incredible fighters and knights. So they were sort of like half Christian monks, half warriors. So at their peak, their temples stretched across Europe, and their allegiance was to the Pope in Rome. So they were the Pope's holy army, so to speak. That's basically the best way to understand these Shia militias that span much of the Middle East. Alright, I'm going to go on like a 30-second tangent. I just can't help myself. But if you don't know much about the Knights Templar, there's some cool documentaries on YouTube. But what I'd really recommend, go on Netflix. There's a show called Nightfall. It starts with a K. And it's about the Knights Templar in like the late 1200s. I was hooked on that show. I can't wait till like season 3. But it's pretty badass. So I'd highly recommend it. I wanted to help people understand the Shia militias before moving on, and the Knights Templar were similar enough to illustrate the idea. Some Westerners have praised Soleimani for fighting ISIS, who are indeed a brutal group, so, that's fine by me. But to understand the nuances here, ISIS are Sunni Muslims, and the Shia Muslims who fight them, they sing songs and write phrases on their missiles. Now, these songs and phrases, they're not anti-ISIS. They're anti-Sunni. The Shia hate the Sunnis more than any other group. They hate the Sunnis more than Jews, Americans, homosexuals, or atheists, who they all hate with a passion. Maybe saying all is a bit of an exaggeration, as in every single individual, but practically speaking, as we go on, we'll see how these Shia militias slaughter civilian Sunni Muslims of all ages. They kill homosexuals and atheists, and kill apostates who leave Islam. But the death penalty for apostasy is a scripture-based doctrine that is enforced in most regions under Islamic governance, not just by Shia Muslims. Also, according to scripture, Muhammad said to kill Jews, so strong anti-Semitism is also very common. To be fair across the board here, anti-Semitism was somewhat common among Christians in the past, especially the Middle Ages and further onwards, but that's very rare among Christians in recent times. Basically the point here is to help you understand that both the Shia militias and Shia civilians hate Sunnis more than all these other people they kill on a regular basis. So that's a strong hatred. Now, basically, while Soleimani fought ISIS, he perpetrated genocide upon tens of thousands of Sunni civilians. Their excuse to the wider world was to insist that the civilians they slaughtered were ISIS supporters and ISIS sympathizers, because they're Sunni and ISIS is Sunni. But, that's like smearing Baptists with sort of saying they're allied with the Westboro Baptist Church. That's just sort of an example I thought of. I'm not really sure how Baptist the Westboro Baptist Church actually is, but you get the idea. So the ugly reality, though, is that the mass slaughter was not targeted at people with an allegiance to ISIS per se. Their target is the Sunni Muslim population in their commitment to wipe them out in a violent form of demographic engineering. So they move Shia Muslims in to populate areas after they burn down the homes of Sunni families and slaughter innocent Sunnis, including women and children. Now, Soleimani killed over 600 Americans and thousands of Iranians to squash protests against the Iranian regime. But Soleimani's main body count was the genocide of tens of thousands of Sunni civilians, and could easily total in the hundreds of thousands. Getting reliable figures on the numbers killed is quite difficult, you can imagine. So in North American political discourse, what is nearly never discussed regarding Soleimani is this aspect of his record. It's the biggest pile of skeletons in his closet. Now, personally, my conscience pushes me to be intellectually honest, so if I'm going to be fair, everything I've listed about Soleimani doesn't mean that Trump should have taken him out or shouldn't have or whatever. That's up for you to decide what you think America's role in the world should be. Now, the thing is, it might feel that way because most of the time people list certain positive or negative things about a person or a group. They are trying to push you to a certain conclusion. So that's not what I'm trying to do here. I'm just trying to list all the facts. They might be bad, they might be good, whatever. It's up to you to make your own conclusions. To make a couple key points in a few moments, we need to skim through the 6 most important incidents regarding Iran from 1979 to 2012. First, the mullahs captured political control of Iran in the 1979 violent revolution. That same year, the Iranian regime perpetrated the now infamous attack on our U.S. embassy in Iran and captured 52 American citizens as hostages. These 52 Americans were held hostage in Iran from November 4th, 1979 until January 1981. On April 18th, 1983, a suicide bomber crashed a truck into the front of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, Lebanon, detonating approximately 2,000 pounds of explosives. The massive blast killed 63 people, including 17 Americans, some of whom were CIA officers. Now, the logistics, the explosives, and the suicide bomber were all part of an operation executed by Iran's proxy terrorist militia, Hezbollah. Now, incident number 3, this is about 6 months later, in October 1983. This same Iran proxy militia killed 241 U.S. military personnel when Hezbollah suicide bombers detonated 2 trucks of explosives at military barracks in Lebanon. The attack was the deadliest day for the United States Marine Corps since the Battle of Iwo Jima in World War II, and produced the highest death toll for the U.S. military overall since the first day of the Tet Offensive in the Vietnam War, which was 1968, I believe, was that Tet Offensive. So, deadliest day in 15 years at that point. Now, incident number 4. A federal judge has ruled that Iran was responsible for the 1996 Khobar Towers bombing, that is Khobar, in which 19 American Air Force personnel were killed and 372 wounded. 2 Iranian government security agencies and senior members of the Iranian government itself provided funding, training, and logistical help to terrorists who carried out the attack on a dormitory that housed U.S. Air Force pilots and staff in Saudi Arabia. Now, being recruited, organized, funded, and commanded by Iran, the terrorist group was a branch of Hezbollah operating in Saudi Arabia. Now, incident number 5. In 2011, the United States foiled an Iranian plot to kill Saudi Arabia's ambassador on American soil. The Obama administration determined Iranian government agents plotted to assassinate Adel al-Jubeir, that is Adel, and then Al-Jubeir. He's the ambassador of Iran's rival Saudi Arabia. As I said, this was attempted while he was in America. Now, the Justice Department officials said 2 men, which included a member of the Iran Revolutionary Guard's elite Quds Force, that Quds Force Soleimani commanded. Now, these 2 men tried to hire a purported member of a Mexican drug cartel to carry out this assassination with a bomb attack while al-Jubeir dined at his favorite restaurant. Yet, this would-be killer was actually a paid government informant, and he told the U.S. authorities all about the plot, which they codenamed Chevrolet. Now, the FBI director at the time, Robert Mueller, said many lives could have been lost. Preet Bharara, the U.S. attorney in Manhattan, said no explosives were actually placed, so no one was in any danger, because the informant's cooperation with authorities. Now, our final incident on this timeline. According to many sources across the political spectrum, Soleimani was also responsible for planning and orchestrating the terrorist attacks in Benghazi on September 11, 2012. The Obama administration lied about it being due to outrage over a YouTube video, which only had a few hundred views by that time. The attackers never claimed it was because of the video, and this September 11, 2012 attack was planned for many weeks or months, starting long before the video ever was released. Now, obviously, in early January, Trump ordered the killing of Qasem Soleimani, there was an opportunity, and so they did a drone strike to take Soleimani out. So now we can look at some of the fallout and developments after Trump ordered Qasem Soleimani killed. So Iran hit U.S. targets in Iraq. They actually fired missiles, 15 ballistic missiles, from Iranian territory, which is quite rare. They fired them at Iraqi military bases housing U.S. troops. Now, this is in retaliation for the U.S. killing of the Iranian commander Qasem Soleimani, of course. And actually, no casualties were reported. The U.S. and Iraqi sources said there were no known casualties, and Iraq said it was warned about the attack in advance. That's important, and that warning was reportedly passed to the U.S. So, if you value the truth, obviously you can't trust much of what partisans on Democrat and Republican side claim, journalists, commentators, and politicians. So here's a CNN report corroborating claims made by Republicans and even Middle East journalists. So this is from January 7th, 2020. Headline, U.S. official, military had early warning of missile attack. This is from CNN's John Kirby. So a U.S. military official has told CNN that the military did have enough early warning of the ballistic missile attack on air bases in Iraq to sound the alarm. So people in harm's way were able to get to bunkers in time, the official said. So if Trump didn't respond with at least something to that attack on the embassy, then it would have made America look pretty weak to the Iranians, which would have further invited them to kind of push the envelope. But after he killed Soleimani, Iran had to kind of save face and look tough to their people. So they did those missile strikes directly from Iran. But if they killed American troops, that would have further escalated. So the fact that they warned secretly about the attack shows that they're trying to de-escalate, and just things have kind of simmered down since then. So to explain the likely effects of Trump's move, this aspect of foreign relations, it's like a complex chess match between leaders of nations and militaries. So this inherently has a higher risk of subjective bias and error, but I'll strive to be as fair and objective as I can here. So my pure opinion still comes later on. This isn't quite that. So Trump eliminating Qasem Soleimani, which does risk escalation, also solidifies deterrence and the expectation of consequences with Iranian officials. You kind of have to make the best calculation you can when you're making decisions like this. So also among Iranian and foreign governments and adversaries, Trump's action further fosters and bolsters sort of an impression and perception of Trump being strategically unpredictable, which is very useful in the foreign policy arena, as a matter of fact. It keeps foreign adversaries on their toes, which makes them less confident and more reluctant to take actions against U.S. interests. Now, this strategic unpredictability has seemed to help quite a bit with North Korea and Kim Jong-un. We haven't achieved denuclearization, but if you look at the facts, Trump has gotten more, has done things with North Korea and Kim Jong-un that no other president has. So just take that for what it's worth. Hopefully we'll see some more results in the future. But the North Korea situation has simmered down. That's just sort of a side note on how strategic unpredictability can yield results in the foreign policy arena. That's just sort of an example. However, to be honest here, unpredictability is often harmful within domestic policy. But Trump is much more stable and consistent in the domestic policy arena than many people claim. I must admit, though, with his trade policy and his tariffs, Trump is mildly erratic, but that appears to be becoming more stable and smooth over the past year with his constant negotiating of dozens of trade deals. And the tariff frenzy has kind of settled down. This is a topic for another time, but I'll just say, a lot of his tariffs, I think, were unnecessary and ill-advised. However, the tariffs with China, it seems to me, are necessary. They have been stealing our intellectual property. So if you can sort of use... tariffs aren't good. They're actually a tax on your own citizens to make them less likely to buy foreign products and stuff.
But with China, in my opinion, they're necessary because they've been stealing our intellectual property for decades and just sort of using tariffs as a bludgeon, as a tool to bring people to the table to get them to stop sort of economic activity that is hurting the United States. So anyway, that's, like I said, topic for another day, so we'll move on.
So let's tie all this together, and then after that I'll kind of give you my personal thoughts. But I don't think it's unreasonable to characterize this situation like this. Basically, Iran has gradually escalated their military activities for at least 7 months or so, about June 2019 onward. And Trump has actually shown significant patience with very few serious military actions. I don't think that's unreasonable to say. And consider this. This is essential here. America's main enemy for decades, the Soviet Union, they never once attacked our embassy in Moscow or any U.S. embassy for that matter. The same goes with the communist tyranny in Cuba. He was, Fidel Castro being a brutal authoritarian dictator that, put people in gulags and killed people that criticized the government and stuff. So basically, respecting embassies is the most bedrock requirement to have any serious diplomacy, whether you're allies or enemies. And in fact, with enemies and foreign adversaries, the stakes are higher. So it's actually even more essential to have diplomacy, because the risks and the consequences of not having that are higher if you're enemies. So attacks on embassies are actually incredibly rare worldwide. However, Iran is responsible for at least 4 attacks on U.S. embassies since 1979. Unless I'm unaware of any further embassy attacks by Iran, so at least 4. So to review all this, kind of squeeze it together so we can analyze it, Soleimani is responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of Sunni Muslims, possibly totaling into hundreds of thousands over the years, and then also thousands of Iranians, and at least 603 Americans. So under Soleimani's command, about 1,500 Iranians have been killed over the past year or so for protesting against the government. And then tens of thousands of Iranian protesters and dissenters, people that criticize and protest the government, have been imprisoned. So put into prisons and gulags and stuff. And then after Soleimani planned about a dozen rocket attacks on Iraqi-U.S. coalition bases, mostly fighting ISIS and stuff in Iraq. And then with one of those rocket attacks killing an American on December 27th. And then he orchestrated the recent attack on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad that began New Year's Eve. After all that stuff, Trump gave the go-ahead when we had a solid opportunity to kill Soleimani without endangering civilians. And Soleimani has had many serious attacks he planned to execute over the course of 2020. That's Soleimani's main occupation. Plus, he's been a terrorist for Iran since 1979 and a top commander since at least 1999. So, in my view, I think it's fair to say people trying to argue the attacks were not imminent are probably anti-Trump partisan hypocrites, because they praised Obama for killing Bin Laden when he was in exile and posed no serious threat. Now, there's plenty of legitimate reasons to oppose Trump's move to take out Soleimani. What I'm saying is that any journalist or news anchor that approves of Obama killing Bin Laden and attacks Trump for his decision for the reason that Soleimani's attack plans were not imminent, then they're a partisan Democrat hack. So, because at the time he was killed, Bin Laden was way less of a threat than Soleimani was before his death. So, saying it's cool for Obama but not Trump is political activism, not journalism. Newsmen with double standards are either too incompetent or too biased to be trusted with the job of informing the American people. So they can admit that and apologize, implement better standards because they're a legitimate news media business. If not, then they're a propaganda business doing political activism. So, in practical terms, they're DNC PR spokespeople. Now, lastly, I saved a couple more speculative items on Soleimani for the end here. I try making serious videos with rigorously researched material. So, to kind of set this up, whatever you think of the deep state, anyone that's done, enough research, you don't have to do much, but you'll know it's been real. The deep state's been real for 60 to 70 years, and depending on how you define it, even more than 130 years. So I'll make a video on how New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison in the late 60s proved that the CIA killed JFK with 67 boxes of files, of which most have leaked and available online. So that's evidence of the deep state. That'll be a future video, though, with links in the description to the evidence. Now, this isn't a tangent. I'll get to the point in a minute. Basically, to my knowledge, at least 3 separate former intelligence officials over 10 years ago informed the public that the CIA protected Bin Laden and helped him stay hidden in Iran. And after one of these guys, William Cooper, talked on lots of radio shows after 9/11 to discuss the U.S. government's involvement in 9/11. On November 5th, 2001, he was shot to death by a whole police squad when he was wanted for tax evasion. So if that was even legitimate, the tax evasion stuff, the authorities negotiate with your lawyer about how you'll turn yourself in with almost all tax evasion cases. So all that scenario seems suspicious to me. And to save some time, that's just a few drops of my evidence for the deep state, which I felt were necessary before these comments I'm about to make. So my videos are long because I think evidence is important when you discuss serious topics. So Dr. Dave Janda, whose past 10 to 15 years of various claims have proven to be true, based on info he got from his military and intelligence sources. So some relevant things to keep in mind alongside Dr. Janda's information is that the CIA hiding Bin Laden in Iran and Hillary Clinton's State Department put out a multi-million-dollar reward on info leading to Bin Laden's whereabouts, which was actually just bait so they could find people who knew about it and shut them up. So Dr. Dave Janda has publicly informed us that the global ruling class deep state type apparatus actually for years has been using Soleimani as sort of an asset to instigate various conflicts. Now, that Gulf of Tonkin incident that was fabricated, that LBJ used to get us into Vietnam and stuff like that. So, if you do enough research, you'll see that there's been these sort of fraudulent false flag incidents. Just do research on false flag events and stuff, and it'll show you that the ruling class has used sort of the military-industrial complex and interventionism and stuff like that, military occupations and military engagements, in order to enrich themselves. I spoke a little bit about this in a video called Bad Foreign Policy, Bush and Obama, where I talked about various bad foreign policy by both Bushes and by Obama and stuff. But it just shows how the ruling class uses our military to enrich themselves, with troops in Afghanistan guarding opium fields. I don't think that's still going on, but it was. So basically, that just shows that it's entirely plausible, even if you don't believe this, but it's entirely plausible that sort of very wealthy, very, very wealthy sort of ruling class type people with a lot of political connections could use Soleimani, to instigate various things that fall in their interest. So basically, Janda has said that the global ruling class, the extremely wealthy people we're going to use Soleimani during 2020 to try to instigate, ideally to sort of start a World War III. Because if you got a major conflict between America and Iran, it could drag in Iran's allies, China and Russia and stuff. And apparently they were going to use Soleimani to orchestrate, attacks and sort of violent incidents across a lot of different countries, not just to drag America into a war, but as much as possible, as many countries as possible, partly because they have so many avenues and levers to sort of be able to profit from chaotic events, and because I think they've been trying to sabotage Trump's presidency for since before he was inaugurated. So elected in November, and he wasn't inaugurated until January. Now, this doesn't mean that Trump is some flawless pinnacle of excellence, and it doesn't mean there aren't good Democrats and stuff. I'm just saying that basically the claim is by Janda that Soleimani was an instrument of the global ruling class, and that they were going to try to instigate various conflicts and use him to implement attacks across the Middle East and possibly beyond. Now, to take 45 seconds to demonstrate how plausible Janda's claim is, super wealthy ruling class families such as the Rothschilds and DuPonts funded and orchestrated the French Revolution in the 1780s and 1790s. This is proven by the words and writings of their operatives, like their own words. Also, Tsar Nicholas refused to accept a central bank controlled by the Rothschilds to be created in Russia. After that, the Rothschilds and their bankers, along with similar families, funded and orchestrated the Bolshevik communist revolution in Russia in 1917. There's actually even more evidence for that. That's pretty conclusive. So I'll actually prove this in a later video. This video is long enough already. So because I'm sure a good portion of people won't believe Dr. Janda's claim, we'll set that aside for my final thoughts. So right before the Deep State and Dave Janda stuff, I reviewed the context around Iran and Soleimani. Now, my core ideals with moral and political principles are pretty thoroughly libertarian, which makes the most moral and prosperous society, in my opinion. My favorite libertarians in internet media all opposed Trump's decision, at least the ones that I've listened to recently. I'd probably agree in my ideal world, but within current world circumstances and America's current government and political system, for reasons I'll talk about elsewhere, I think Trump's move to take out Soleimani here was a very effective strategic move, in my opinion. So, for 7 months, Iran escalated until they killed and wounded numerous Americans, and attempted to burn down the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, Iraq. So without imposing a high enough price for their continuously escalating actions, I see no good reason to believe that Iran would not have continued to be even more bold and more violent. Therefore, unless we could accept that and live with that, Trump had to take a strong enough action to impose consequences and establish deterrence, something persuasive enough that Iran would not continue along the clearly noticeable road of escalating militarism. So there are other strategies Trump could have used to achieve deterrence and put a stop to it. So you have to decide what you think. If you're upset with Trump's decision, then I see two general alternatives for people who are serious about forming rational opinions. So number one is to not intervene and accept Iran's continued violent escalations, to allow them to occupy and control the Strait of Hormuz with their military, and therefore manipulate global oil supply to boost their oil profits. Then Iran would use those profits for more terrorism and regional imperialism, to control more cities and capitals of neighboring countries, like they already do. Or number two is to choose what you think would have been a better alternative to Trump's decision. So basically, and if you want to be nitpicky, you can kind of split number two into maybe two more things. So have number two be like economic consequences and tariffs or sanctions rather, and go to the UN and have the world community impose stricter sanctions, or number three being some sort of military action and striking something else in order to establish the expectation of consequences, so that they would be more reluctant to continue their obvious path of escalation that they've been pursuing for 7 months or so here. So that's basically what I see as the options. But basically, the circumstances Trump was operating in was we had a window of opportunity to take out Soleimani, and he had to decide rather quickly to whether or not to take him out. And under the situation that they had intelligence that Soleimani had attacks planned in the near future and throughout 2020. Now, if you don't believe the claims that the attacks planned were imminent, in the very near future, well, then we at least have to admit that Soleimani did have some attacks planned at some point. I mean, that was his job. So, and to mostly use these militias, these proxy militias in other countries, using those countries' own citizens that were loyal to Shia Islam, in order to conduct various attacks and operations in all these countries in the region.
So, in the words of the great Forrest Gump, that's all I have to say about that. Thanks for listening to this Iran video, though. I put a lot of work and research into it, basically so you don't have to. That's the service I'm trying to provide. So there's a link in the description to my Subscribestar account if you'd like to donate and help make this a full-time Monday through Friday show in the future. That's the eventual goal, is to just have like a full-time show. And you'll be doing me a favor in helping if you click like and you comment. It helps boost up videos in the algorithms for them to be suggested for people to watch. And just thank you for listening, everyone. Long live philosophy, and I'll talk to you guys soon.
Hey, mama, don't you treat me wrong.